So the reading today from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 23. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Then Herod, when he saw that he'd been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene.
May I add my welcome to Tom's. Really good to see a number here in person and others online as well. Thank you for tuning in. My name's Mikey, if we've not met. You are the one, Neo. You may have spent the last few years looking for me, but I've spent my entire life looking for you. Hopefully many will recognize that quote from the film The Matrix, the movie based around the search for the one, the long prophesied one who would uniquely be able to save the human race. People spent their whole lives looking for the one. And if you remove the graphics and the slow-mo action replay sort of stuff, that is essentially The Matrix, the story of the Jewish people in the Old Testament as well. That is who Matthew is predominantly writing his gospel to, and they too had been looking for the one. For the Old Testament Jewish believers, it was the Messiah or the Christ, the long prophesied one who God had promised would be his saving king. Except the Jews, well, they had been waiting for hundreds of years. It's hard for us to put ourselves in their shoes because we are not used to having to wait, especially as Londoners. We get annoyed if we have to wait more than 3 minutes for the next tube, or if we have to wait 10 seconds at a supermarket self-service machine that won't confirm our bag. Well, let's be honest, even 5 seconds if our internet doesn't connect. We are pretty bad at waiting. But the Jews, they had been waiting for generations at this point. They could say that Matrix quote for real. They had spent their entire lives looking, waiting for the one. But now, here is Matthew writing his gospel, telling them that he has found the one. Jesus is the long-promised Messiah, the Christ, the one that they've been looking for all this time. Matthew is claiming that a whole new era has begun, the moment that every Old Testament believer had been waiting for. But Matthew's first readers, it wasn't quite so easy for them. They needed to be really sure about this because they had a lot to lose. Following Jesus would have suddenly put them at odds with the current Jewish religious leaders and establishment. They would be seen as heretics, kicked out of their communities. So they couldn't afford to get this wrong. But if they had found the Messiah, well then clearly they needed to go all in and fully get behind him. It is all or nothing with the one. So they needed to be absolutely sure, is Jesus really the one? That is the big question. And it isn't actually just a Jewish question either. I mean, if you're anything like me, you will wonder sometimes as well, is it really worth going all in for Jesus? Is he really the one in that sense? Is he the one worth giving my whole life to follow? And especially because there are many things that can make us doubt. And that is bringing us to our first point, which you'll find on the service sheets on the website. A rejected king. If verse 16 of our passage were made into a movie, it should come with an 18 certificate. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. It is a horrific scene, isn't it? You can imagine the mothers screaming as their baby boys are plucked from their grasps, the looks on the fathers' faces as they stand there, powerless, speechless. And we are right to be shocked by this mass infant genocide. I mean, the first chapter and a half of Matthew's Gospel, if you've been with us the last few weeks, has been so positive as God announced this wonderful new era of his long-promised king. And everything seemed so exciting as, sure enough, Jesus was born, the wise men come to visit. But suddenly here, things turn very nasty. Whereas the wise men had searched for Jesus to worship him, well, in verse 13 we read that Herod searched for the child to destroy him. See, right from Jesus' birth, there is real hatred and rejection directed at Jesus. And the obvious question is why? Well, we thought a bit last week about how it's essentially because people don't want Jesus to be their king. That was certainly true for King Herod. For him, Jesus was a rival king, a literal threat to his rule. And so we see in verse 16 that he is desperate to get rid of Jesus. Herod had hoped that the wise men would lead him to Jesus, but when that doesn't work, he becomes furious, we read, and moves to this horrific plan of genocide to exterminate enough babies to make sure that Jesus is out of the picture. Now, obviously, Herod's reaction is very extreme. Most people wouldn't dream of reacting like that. But actually, Matthew has given us hints that an underlying rejection of Jesus characterizes everyone. Last week we saw that all Jerusalem, along with Herod, were troubled at the news of a king in town, a new king. And truth be told, in every generation, since Herod to the present day, people have rejected Jesus as king. Because, I guess, as the famous poem Invictus says, everyone prefers being the master of their own fate and the captain of their own soul, rather than having anyone else in that position to call the shots. If you've ever had the opportunity to properly, fully explain the gospel to someone, you're bound to have experienced this. People don't like the idea that Jesus should have a claim on their lives as king. I've had friends who were initially pretty interested in Christianity, coming along to things, but in the end, they weren't prepared to hand over the reins of their life to Jesus. Thus far, they haven't been willing to make Jesus their master, their captain, their king. Or perhaps we might see this underlying rejection of Jesus in other ways. I guess many of us will have asked people to Christian events, but they simply have never come. And I guess they just can't be bothered to even consider Jesus. Maybe most of our colleagues at the moment seem to just dismiss anything to do with Christianity, and you feel pretty isolated as a Christian in your workplace. Even on TV or on social media, it's hard to get away from comedians mocking Jesus and so on. And so as we come across all this rejection around us, we can wonder sometimes whether Jesus really is the one worth going all in for. But this passage, well, it helps us with that. See, it sets our expectations. God's king has been rejected from the very beginning. Why should we expect it to be any different today? That is just the way that it has always been. It's not because Jesus isn't the real deal. No, it's simply because people don't want anyone else to be king of their lives. But as well as setting our expectations, Matthew also wants to give us real confidence despite this context of rejection. And that brings us to our second point. Jesus may be a rejected king, but God's plan for Jesus is unstoppable. Now, on the surface of our passage, the events themselves seem to contradict this at first. I mean, Mary and Joseph are forced to leave their home country and flee to Egypt. Baby Jesus becomes a refugee. And so we might think, well, hang on. It looks like God is on the back foot here, trying to keep up with Herod's plans. It looks like the opposition is setting the agenda, not God. It's one of those moments when we stop and wonder, has God's plan somehow been derailed or faced a setback? A few years ago, my parents, when we were going to visit, they seemed to like doing this, to pull out all sorts of old junk that they're trying to then fob off on us as they clear out their house. And a few years ago, they pulled out this old report from my days in primary school. And rather embarrassingly, this piece of paper turned out to be a report about my exploits in the school chess team. Apparently, the 10-year-old me had a very solid defense and a flair for attacking play. What do you know? To be honest, I can only remember losing, really. But one thing I do remember learning from chess is that you have to plan at least one move ahead. To always be a step ahead. That is the key. Well, if this passage were a chess game, it might look as though God were in trouble. It looks a bit like Herod might be cornering him, hunting down his king, if you excuse the chess pun. But actually, like the ultimate chess master, God is always a step ahead. I mean, here we see Herod, one of the most powerful people in the world at the time, using all of his resources to hunt Jesus down. And yet, Herod's best efforts prove powerless to stop God's plan for Jesus. I mean, last week we saw Herod's plan A was foiled as God warned the wise men in a dream not to bring Herod news of Jesus' location. And even when he moves in our passage today to this horrific plan B, to cover all his bases and wipe out any baby boy that could be Jesus, well, again, he fails. I mean, look at verse 13, the heavenly tip-off that Joseph gets. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." You see, God knew Herod's next move. And God, well, he was a step ahead. And Matthew reinforces this further with his narrator's comments. I mean, have a look at verse 15, halfway through, if you would. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew tells us that this event fulfilled something that the Lord himself had spoken and planned through the prophet Hosea about 700 years before Jesus. You see, God had for a long time been a step ahead. This isn't some narrow escape for Jesus. No, Jesus going to Egypt was part of God's plan all along. In fact, that quote from Hosea is about God's son coming back out of Egypt. See, not only was Jesus' escape a certainty, but his future return to Israel was already prepared as well. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens in verses 19 to 20. God appears to Joseph in another dream, another heavenly tip-off, and calls them out of Egypt back to Israel. But you may have noticed that that's actually not the only prophecy that is fulfilled. In verse 17, after Herod's appalling actions of killing these children, we're similarly told that then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet. Now, we must be clear, it's not that God can be held responsible in any way for Herod's actions. God totally hates the evil that Herod did. But in verse 18, Matthew does parallel the weeping in Bethlehem at this event with the weeping that Jeremiah wrote of back when Israel was sent into exile. And the broad point is that not even tragedies like this can catch God off guard. Probably had all had those embarrassing moments when you're in a conversation, but you slightly zone out, and then you suddenly realize that you've been daydreaming, and you're desperately then trying to catch up with the conversation and try not to get caught out, try to get away with it. Hopefully you don't have that situation too much at work. But needless to say, God is not like us. That never happens to him. He never loses his attention. He's never desperately trying to play catch-up. God is never surprised by anything. He's not surprised when people reject or oppose his plans. He's seen it many times before. And even though people may sometimes do horrific things trying to reject him, his plans, they are never threatened. Quite the opposite. He is always a step ahead. And just in case we hadn't yet got the point, Matthew gives us yet another example in verse 23, right at the end of our passage. This is a real distinctive of Matthew's Gospels, all these Old Testament fulfillments. And when he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. The disliked northern town of Nazareth was to epitomize and to add to Jesus' rejection, really. And yet, again, all still within God's sovereign control. It is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, some of us struggle to even control Siri or Alexa on our devices. But here we see God in total, utter, complete control. I mean, all these fulfillments, one after another, increasingly just give us this sense that despite Jesus' rejection, God's plan for Jesus is simply unstoppable. It is like a gigantic boulder, if you can picture, at the very top of a mountain that is suddenly set loose, and it begins rolling and picks up more and more speed until it is at full pelt, hurtling down this mountain, careering through anything in its way. Nothing can stop this boulder. If anyone were to try, it wouldn't be pretty. No matter what is thrown at it, it will just keep rolling on. Well, that is the sense that Matthew is giving us here of God's plan for Jesus. It is simply unstoppable. So no matter what rejection might be thrown at Jesus, well, God's plan will keep rolling on. In fact, as we read on in Matthew, we'll see how Jesus' rejection is actually a crucial part of God's plan. His plan, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, to save his people from their sin. See, the same kind of hostile rejection that we see at Jesus' birth, well, that is used by God to take Jesus ultimately to the cross, the place where God achieves that salvation for anyone who puts their trust in Jesus. You see, God's plan never suffers defeats or setbacks. Now, here we see God's unstoppable commitment to work out his saving plan through Jesus. And that means that Jesus really is the one, God's long-promised saving king. But what are the implications of this for us? Well, I think at least a couple that I've put on the sheet for us there. First, don't be shaken by rejection of Jesus. For those of us who are already trusting Jesus as our King, what assurance this passage should give us? I mean, sometimes we can look around at all the rejection around us in society and personally, and we can wonder if we're doing the right thing sometimes by following Jesus. Whether it's people on TV or online mocking Christianity, or colleagues rejecting our invitations or dismissing Jesus. But while all that rejection is obviously sad, Matthew tells us that it is to be expected. Jesus has always been a rejected king. That's just the way that it is in God's plan. And so we don't need to be shaken by it. Because despite every bit of opposition that has come and gone in history, Jesus has remained king. Jesus is ruling as king right now. He has been ruling for the last 2,000 years. He has seen every wave of opposition, from the Enlightenment to Nietzsche to Dawkins, but none of it has had any impact on his rule whatsoever. He is still ruling. And so even if society were to really ramp up pressure against Jesus' teaching in the UK, become more hostile, even if our offices start banning all Christian groups and invitations, well, even still, we need not be shaken. See, Herod shows us that the most powerful people in the world, let alone our HR department or whoever it might be, they're powerless to stop Jesus from ruling. God will ensure that his plan for Jesus keeps rolling on like that unstoppable boulder. And so don't be shaken by rejection. But secondly, go all in for Jesus. If God is fully committed to Jesus, then we are right to be too. I suspect we all know the feeling of trying to get into a cold swimming pool. I think against all our natural instincts, it is always better to dive right in. I mean, if you try to go in little by little, it is so much harder. Sort of one foot goes in and the other foot goes in. You kind of get up to your ankles, your knees, and that's sort of normally about the time where I've been known to go running back to comfort. But it is so much better when you just dive straight in. When you do that, I mean, sure, it's a bit of a shock to the system at first, but as Michael McIntyre says, if you've seen the sketch, it's all right once you're in. See, diving fully in is the thing to do. That is how to really enjoy it. And it is just the same with Jesus. It can be very tempting to just keep sort of dipping our toes in the water with Jesus, but not to go all in. Perhaps we're still pretty daunted by the rejection all around us. I mean, what will people think if I fully commit myself to Jesus? Won't my friends and my colleagues reject me as well? See, maybe we've experienced something of the unpleasant coldness of dipping our toes in the water, and we're not sure that we want to go much further. But Matthew, he would encourage us to dive fully in. He's saying Jesus is the one, God's king. He deserves our full allegiance. Let's resist the temptation to go running back to the temporary comfort of the world. Instead, we're right to throw ourselves fully in with Jesus. And as we do, who knows how the Lord might use us in his sovereign plan? We'll see in Matthew as we continue on that God's plan involves bringing more people from rejecting Jesus to accepting him as their king. And that is true even in the times of COVID restrictions. I think it's very easy at the moment with lots of people working from home and limited interactions with people to sort of feel that evangelism to colleagues in particular is sort of on hold until things get back to normal. But let's remember, God is always in sovereign control. He's not surprised by COVID. COVID hasn't affected the effectiveness of his plans for Jesus. It is still unstoppable. See, God is still committed to saving people from their sin. And who knows, the next person might well be a colleague of ours. What confidence we can have to go all in for Jesus, even in these strange COVID times. But as we close, there may just be a few people perhaps listening in online who are newer to Christian things. Well, if that's us, can you see from our passage how God has orchestrated history to fulfill his plans for Jesus. Can you see how God won't let anything stop Jesus from being king? And so can you see how refusing to make Jesus your king would actually put you at odds with God's plan? Well, I'm sure that Matthew would urge you to make Jesus your king personally. I mean, the waiting is over. Jesus is the one. There's not going to be another option later down the line. It is time to get on the right side of God's unstoppable plan before it is too late. If you think you might be ready to do that, do ask the person who invited you along today, or else you can get in touch with one of us here on the staff team. But if you're not yet sure about going all in for Jesus, well, do at least keep listening to what he has to say. Join us again as Matthew continues to flesh out, tell us all about Jesus and how following him is the absolutely best thing imaginable for each and every one of us. Let me close our time now, if I would, in a prayer. Father God, thank you so much that although Jesus has always been rejected by many, he is nonetheless your King and Saviour. Please help us and give us great confidence to throw our lot in with Jesus, knowing that your plan to save more and more people through him will keep rolling on, no matter what. Amen.